We know that the world faces many challenges. The global pandemic has stretched health services to the limit and led to job losses all over the world, resulting in poverty for millions. At the same time, the world is facing a climate emergency, but action on this has been slow and inadequate. We are waking up to the scale and implications of the destruction of habitats and loss of plant and animal species. There are many global commitments to tackling these challenges. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and, from 2021, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. What is needed now is a platform to bring people together from all walks of life, from all over the world, to catalyse ideas, commitment and action and make change happen. The Forum for Global Challenges is designed to do just that. Led by the University of Birmingham, we are working with organisations across the world to bring together ideas, evidence and experience. In 2022, Birmingham will host a forum which will bring together these ideas and the evidence to support them to create a manifesto of solutions and catalyse global action. The forum takes place in the same year as Birmingham will host the Commonwealth Games, supporting the vision of the Games in creating peaceful, sustainable and prosperous communities. Everyone can get involved. Join our online community. Be part of the solution. The Forum for Global Challenges, catalysing change for an inclusive, healthier and sustainable future.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Claire Bracegirdle. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. This event is part of the University of Birmingham's International Development Department Seminar Series, which brings together scholars and practitioners working on international development to the university to share their latest research and ideas. The event is also part of the Forum for Global Challenges, which was introduced by the video that you just saw. The Forum is a University of Birmingham-led initiative that aims to catalyse action in response to the global challenges of climate change and inequalities. It has 8 topic areas, including one on restoring nature. The Forum hosts an online community which everyone is welcome to participate in by posting blogs, asking questions and accessing resources. This event is being recorded. It will be posted on IDD's YouTube channel and on the Forum for Global Challenges. It would be fantastic if you could introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us where you're joining from. And keep in mind that we'll have some time for questions at the end. Please ask your questions using the Q&A function, which should be in the bottom toolbar on Zoom. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Bram Boothscher. Professor Boothscher is Professor and Chair of the Sociology of Development and Change Group at Wageningen University. Last year, with Robert Fletcher, he published The Conservation Revolution: Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene. Professor Boothscher also co-leads the Convivial Conservation Research Project, Conviva.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you also to Renuma, Harriet, and Molly for organizing this. It's incredibly well organized, so I'm very pleased to be here. I'll get right into it because I think it's important that we hear from the other speakers and that we have enough time for the discussion as well. So I hope everybody can hear me well, and from wherever you are, thanks for joining. I want to make two points and briefly elaborate on those. First of all, that this is a seminar about conservation. That conservation needs radical change, right? At the moment. I'm going to be a bit blunt here, but at the moment, the global conservation sector is, despite its focus on so much green and biodiversity, etc., is actually rather unsustainable and part of a broader unsustainable frame that that we need to challenge. And the second point I want to make is that if we want to move towards an alternative form of conservation, like a convivial conservation, we must directly address hegemonic power, right? And that includes forms of conservation, organization, funding, but also who represents conservation, how and why. And in order to make those points, let me share my screen here. See if this works. Here you can see a little picture that actually represents a saying that we have in the Netherlands, where I'm currently based, mobbing with the taps wide open. And for me, this really represents modern day conservation. Two white guys frantically mobbing the floor. I mean, it's a little bit, again, unnuanced perhaps here, because of course the conservation community is much more diverse, but it does sum up at least, the main problem that conservation faces, namely that it's actually become quite good at mobbing the floor, at saving species from extinction, at here or there, despite the sixth extinction crisis that we are in, and enlarging the protected area state, for example, but without actually addressing the roots of the problem, right? So conservation discussions in the mainstream are mainly about, the temperature of the water, or whether the tap needs to go a little bit to the left or to the right, but it actually never actually really head-on addresses the main problems that conservation is part of, and that ultimately we simply need to close the tap. Now, this is, of course, a very difficult thing to do, and my next slide shows why that is the case. I always love showing these graphs. This comes from Anthropocene discussions around the Great Acceleration. That shows that over the last 150 to 200 years, across all kinds of socioeconomic, but also Earth system trends and factors, things have grown tremendously, right? From energy use, water use, paper production, tourism, to shrimp agriculture, CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, etc., surface temperature, and all that. So, clearly, the picture is much more nuanced than this. But what this does show, I think, is that on a planetary scale, we're on a trajectory that is completely unsustainable, right? If this continues, across these graphs in this particular way, clearly that's complete madness, and I think most of us here will know this. The point for me really is that, right, over the last 300 to 600 years, right, the system that we've built to enable this is completely focused, right, in terms of organization, in terms of trade, etc., on making this happen, right? So actually confronting this also means confronting 300 to 600 years of organizational development that have enabled this. So it's maybe easy to point this out, but obviously it's not that easy to go against that or to change that. But I will come back to that a little bit later. For now, to really sort of hammer the point home that conservation is, sort of part and parcel of this unsustainable picture, right? I want to show this graph, right? This is basically, amongst others, the success of mainstream conservation, right? Over the last 100 years, the amount of areas under formal protection, both marine and terrestrial protected areas, have grown tremendously. And obviously, the graphs actually look, quite alike. They all have this sort of hockey stick, sort of strong upward slope, as from the 1950s, 1960s, and with conservation no different. Obviously this is not the only main sort of strategy for conservation. The other main strategy has been to link conservation with capital, through payments for ecosystem services or natural capital accounting, etc. But this immediately goes to show that, not just in sort of an obvious way, right? These two kind of look alike, but it's exactly in this time when conservation has been rather successful in promoting, right, protected areas, that we've seen the intensification and the rise of the sixth extinction crisis, right? So literally over the last 40 to 50 years, when we've seen, a massive awareness of the intense ecological degradation, global, climate change, massive biodiversity loss, etc. It's exactly the same time that conservation has become more successful in two of its main strategies, right? Protected areas and linking conservation with capitalism. And these two things need to be tackled head on. That's the only way, I think, that conservation can move forward and actually become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And this means, that conservation and capitalism, in many ways, have been very, very similar. They played different roles within that historical system, obviously, but both, have focused on alienating humans from the rest of nature, right? Protected areas very obviously, but commodifying nature equally alienates us from the rest of nature, right? It makes it all sellable. And second of all, it's so focused on this growth principle to enable all this growth, right? That it, at the same time undermines all of life. So it's clear that we need a conservation revolution. And, I want to spend a couple of minutes and then I'll wrap up, just outlining a couple of points that I feel together with my co-author Rob Fletcher, but also a larger group of people that we work with, on some of the principles that such a convivial conservation can be based on. Whatever else it does, it needs to be focused on going beyond growth and capital and beyond the nature people dichotomy. Right? You can't do one or the other, as some modern of recent conservation paradigms do. You need to do both together. Otherwise, it's simply not realistic. And in fact, realism is something that we often hear, right? These kind of ideas of moving beyond this kind of stuff is not realistic, and that's exactly the point, right? We need to be, focusing on an act of alternative realism to actually get to a different world. And we must do this together with a much larger group and wave of movements and organizations that demand, structural transformation. So conservation must always be part of a much broader movement. Conservation often seen as separate, right? Also in its capitalist form. But it must be part and parcel of much broader, struggles, right, across all kinds of dimensions. And here you just see some of them, mostly still focused on environmental issues, but also going beyond them. And that's absolutely critical. So a couple of things that we then see is, first of all, if we want to actually have a chance of pushing for this, we must focus, directly on power. First of all, we must focus on actors, on different actors, and I will come to that. And we must focus on combining short-term and long-term actions, right? We must have some long-term direction combined with short-term action in order to get there. So in our book, we pose 5 long-term propositions for convivial conservation. First, to move away from the idea of protected areas towards a form of promoted areas, or what ICCA, the Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas Consortium, would call territories of life. So I think that that's a very powerful way to put it, and I hope that June will say a bit more about that. Second, that we must drastically relearn the needs of humans and human natures in relation to the needs of non-human natures and animals, right? Over the last 300 to 600 years, the system that has been built up has focused on making sure that we have needs that relate to, that all those growth curves, right, that keep on pushing us to buy, more, be unhappy, so that, we need to consume and consume more and more. And we need to actually, drastically change that to also put that in a much better balance with the needs of non-human natures and animals. Tourism is not the way forward. As we've now clearly seen with the pandemic, right? Immediately, the first sort of, market blip in tourism, the major one, and conservation organizations are screaming, that they don't have any funding anymore. In South Africa, ironically, some private conservation reserves even had to shoot some animals because they couldn't actually feed them anymore. So we must move away from what we call touristic voyeurism to engaged visitation, a very different idea about travel, more focused on the long term and taking care. We must move away from spectacular natures, right, spectacular environmentalisms, to everyday natures, away from thinking that conservation is done something very far and that it's also very near to us in our daily lives and with the natures around us, even if they don't look like the Discovery Channel. And finally, moving away from privatized expert technocracy to more common democratic engagement focused on care, right? Focused on connection and focused on relation with the rest of nature. These are ideal propositions for the long term where we want to go to. And in the short term, it will be this intense political struggle. And we think that 5 concrete actions can help to shift the political terrain. First of all, decolonizing conservation must be at the basis of all of this, right? Through historic reparations and a broader and more holistic decolonizing of conservation more generally. Second, we propose a conservation basic income, which relates to basic income schemes more generally, but focused on enabling people to actually have the space and time to connect with their environment and think about a different sort of development trajectory and landscape trajectory moving forward. So this is not just about rural communities somewhere far, but it could also be city dwellers, right? Enabling city dwellers to actually think about, convivial conservation in the city could be an incredible sort of push forward for conservation more generally. Conservation organizations must absolutely 100% rethink, their relations with big corporations and the state, right? Thinking that we can just all come around the table and work it all out together, whilst they continue to be focused on pushing those drafts is a failing strategy, and then it's better to organize counterpower through, for example, what we call a convivial conservation coalition that brings together different actors um, to push, for political change. And this must be inclusive, but not inclusive to all. I mean, inclusive, of course, diversity. Everybody talks about that, but I think we need actually different, spokespeople moving towards the front and actually also de-emphasize certain voices. So yes, of course, we must be inclusive, but maybe a little bit less with big CEOs that keep on pushing these main things and keep on talking that consumers must do this or that. That same tired rhetoric we have heard enough of, and we need much less inclusion of that and inclusion of other voices. And finally, we must work on the landscape level, right, to actually rethink, practically how to integrate humans and the rest of nature and development models in living landscapes moving forward. And very soon, we literally heard today that together with the Oak Foundation and colleagues in Southern Africa, they will be trying to test some of these things out in South Africa as from literally almost today in a new project. So I'm really looking forward to that and hope to be able to say more about that in the near future. So for now, thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Bouscher. Now moving on to our next speaker, June Rubis. Dr. Rubis is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Sydney and a co-author of Territories of Life, a report recently released by the Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas Consortium.
Hi, everyone. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak to you today. And also thank you, Bram. That was an amazing presentation, and I agree completely. Hi, everyone. My name is June Rubis. I'm a postdoctoral fellow, as mentioned by Claire. And I'm also the co-chair of a Documenting Territories of Life with the ICCA Indigenous and Local Communities Conserved Areas Consortium. So many studies have demonstrated that Indigenous peoples and local communities are so central to sustaining diversity of life on Earth that it would be impossible to address the interlinked biodiversity and climate crisis without them. Indigenous peoples and local communities are estimated to hold at least 50% of the world's land under customary systems, but their rights have only been formally recognized in a small fraction of the claimed lands. Indigenous peoples and local communities often face overlapping political and economic interests, seeking to either protect nature or exploit nature within their lands and territories. So therefore, in thinking about new directions in conservation, I believe that the work that we do, the way forward is to explicitly recognize and respect Indigenous peoples and local community sovereignty, laws, rights of territories and nature resources, ways of lives, and onto epistemologies. And in this talk, I will explore this further on a local scale with my work in Sarawak, Malaysia, Borneo, on human orangutan relations, and also on a global scale with our Territories of Life report. So human orangutan relations provide a plurality of ways to think about conservation engagement, where orangutans and people are simultaneously impacted by and workings of conservation as it seeks to control and manage Indigenous and local peoples and the relations with customary lands and orangutans. And here I will speak briefly on recentering Indigenous naming of the maias, which the Ibans called orangutans, that enables practices of being with rather than managing off. And such practice places the maias in different relations with and rethink how we can support conservation with Indigenous peoples and local communities. To many conservationists, Ibans and other rural Indigenous and local populations continue to threaten wildlife species with their land practices and social life. Conservationists generally define the maias within a discursive constructive divide that separates humans and nature, revealing a relationship of control and domination. And is defined and understood as I always have to clarify which type of maias is it? Is it a maias kasak? Is it a maias rambai? This method of classification pays attention to where the orangutan or the maias is most likely found and its appearance, and this helps the Ibans keep track of which maias is in currently what territories or environment. So for the Ibans of Batang-ay, the maias have been part of their world through interrelations and interdependency for many centuries. And according to Apar, my interlocutor, there are several stories that convey the interspecies relationality of the Batang-ay Ibans and the Mayas. And these stories include orangutan helping the Iban women to give birth safely. So for the interest of mainstream conservation, often these stories, whether of the orangutan or another animal of interest, become abstracted from their context. And particularly for conservation, this idea of a moral obligation works in terms of regulating self-enforcement within communities. So for instance, an education campaign that focuses on the law and the consequences of killing a maias or an orangutan, while simultaneously reminding the communities of their obligation to the orangutan, assigns greater conservation responsibility and therefore consequences to the communities. So these stories that I shared with me are the proper ways to be in this world and to maintain good relations and belonging for both humans and wildlife, according to Bantu Patangay. Of course, there's a danger, however, to disentangle stories from their in-place context and critique Ibans or local communities for not fulfilling their end of the agreement. And such a limited and extractive engagement misses the potential to understand how fuller interspecies relationship could exist, and this reinforces problematic relationships. So by attending to these relations, we must show a responsiveness to how we attend or care beyond the imperial modes of constructed care. So it's therefore necessary to consider how we approach indigenous onto epistemologies in conservation work. It is these ideas of knowing the maias beyond to protect, but rather to connect in place that maintains orangutan human relations as more than an abstracted species with conservation value. So in other words, we must know the maias beyond its mostly charismatic and conservation value and carefully think through its embodied code relations with place and events living in the same lands. So how would the idea of recognizing and upholding indigenous peoples and local communities' sovereignty, law, rights of territories and natural resources, ways of life, and onto epistemologies also look on a global scale? To answer this question, I also turn to my work with the ICCA. The ICCA is a global movement association to support the indigenous and local communities' conserved areas. So it's a member-based civil society organization supported by an international semi-volunteer secretariat based in 22 countries, with a mission to promote the appropriate recognition of and support to indigenous peoples and community conserved areas and territories at local, national, and international levels. The report that we recently released, called The Territories of Life, is to influence negotiations at the UN Biodiversity and Climate Conventions, with major meetings on the horizon later this year. So this report features 17 case studies of specific territories of life from 5 continents. It includes 6 analyses of national level context and some of the leading examples of policy and legal recognition of indigenous people's rights and community conservation. There's also global spatial analysis that shows that indigenous peoples and local communities are the de facto custodian protected and conserved areas. And they are also conserving an estimated 17% of the world's land outside of the official protected and conserved areas. And if they were appropriately recognized along these areas, the total coverage would increase to 31% of the world's land. However, in significant number of the case studies in this report, indigenous peoples and local communities have contentious relationships with mainstream conservation sector, depending on the extent to which their rights, governance systems, and ways of life are respected and upheld. And in other cases, they're strategically trying to use these protected area laws and conservation designations to defend against other threats such as mining. Yet indigenous peoples and local communities are on the front lines of resisting the main industrial drivers of global diversity loss and climate breakdown, including mining, oil and gas, logging and monoculture plantations. They often face violence and retribution for resisting these industries. So these threats can have a cumulative and compounded effects on indigenous peoples and local communities, which in turn pose longer-term threats to their resilience. However, they continue to resist and respond in diverse ways. So even in the face of immense threats, indigenous peoples and local communities have extraordinary resilience and determination. They're adapting to rapidly changing contexts and using diverse strategies to secure their rights and territories. And although they sometimes face setbacks, they also have made key advances. They continue to pursue self-determination, self-governance, peace, and sustainability, sometimes against all odds. So the work that ICCA does from the community level to the global level is to support indigenous and local communities' rights and collective lands and territories of life in global commitments and national level implementation. So in practical terms, this means pursuing this agenda requiring a massive increase in social, political, legal, institutional, and financial support for indigenous peoples and local communities, primarily from governments, but also from public and private financial institutions. And we believe that social movements and civil society organizations working in human rights, conservation, climate change, and land issues need to come together to work on this shared agenda. So if I have any time left, I don't know if I'd like to briefly talk about the recommendations that we prescribe in this report. We recommend that, for example, we need to recognize and respect the central role of indigenous peoples and local communities in sustaining a healthy planet. and the deep cultural and spiritual relationships and the governance systems though, through which they do so. Support Indigenous peoples and local communities to secure their collective lands and territories, strengthen their self-determined governance systems, and sustain their cultures and ways of lives on their own terms. Embed and uphold human rights, including Indigenous peoples' rights and other group-specific rights, in all policies, laws, institutions, programs, and decision-making processes that affect Indigenous peoples and local communities, both internationally and domestically. Halt the drivers of biodiversity loss and climate breakdown, and halt the threats and violence against the peoples and communities who are defending our planet. And finally, we need to develop a human rights-based financing as a key lever for equitable and effective implementation of global commitments, including on biodiversity, climate, and sustainable development. If you'd like to read the report more, there's the URL on the bottom. And thank you so much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rubis, for talking about your research and for highlighting how important culture is for conservation. Staying with that theme, we're now going to move on to Bas Verschuren. Dr. Verschuren is a lecturer and researcher at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University. He co-chairs the IUCN WPCA Specialist Group on the Cultural and Spiritual Values of Protected Areas, and also coordinates the Sacred Natural Sites Initiative.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'll do a good attempt at sharing my screen first. Here we are. Should it be good now? Thank you very much for having me as one of the speakers on the panel today about the future of conservation. We've seen a couple of very inspiring presentations already. I really like the way how they are interlinked. And my intention is to give a brief overview of the cultural and spiritual significance of nature and how this basically is a driving force behind why people practice conservation. And I think with that, I'm adding a slightly different note that's already present probably in the other people's presentations, but still it's important to pause and actually take a look at what it means, cultural and spiritual significance of nature. I'll be talking from my experience as an applied researcher and conservation practitioner, working with the World Commission on Protected Areas Specialist Group on Cultural and Spiritual Values of Nature. I've also been developing and coordinating a small conservation initiative on sacred natural sites over the years. And I'm currently a lecturer and researcher at Wageningen University's Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group. So blending applied academic work with currently more theoretically academic work and a history in actually conservation projects undertaken with local and indigenous people in different places around the world. So from that experience, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the inspiration, this cultural and spiritual significance of nature. Where does that come from? What does it look like? And how can we understand that? I'll talk a little bit about the origins of this topic area in the conservation movement as we've seen this evolve over the past decades. And then I'll focus on two things, mostly how sacred natural sites have been in the focus, and then how folks have been put more on developing best practice guidance for cultural and spiritual significance, as seen from the perspective of our little specialist group under the World Commission on Protected Areas. Here and there, I'll touch on some more academic notes where I think that's appropriate. But let's first do a small tour of basically inspirational aspects. Here is a protected area in Mongolia, Bogd, and we see monks and park rangers coming down a sacred mountain, celebrating not just the life of Genghis Khan or Buddhism as such, but also having prayed to the local spirits in heavens as a celebration of prosperity for this park, for those lands. Very ancient rituals and ways of connecting to the lands that are currently part and parcel of the way that the protected area is being managed, with involvement of local shamanistic leaders as well as Buddhist leaders. There's other ways of connecting to land as a kid when you play out in nature, and some researchers point out that if you do this, if you connect to nature, you have meaningful experiences in nature, then later on you're more likely to be prone to sustainability or conservation as such. Although relatively little researched, I like to think that's true, so I love putting my kids out there. A very well-known place, Uluru, in the center of Australia, one of the Earth's largest monoliths, sacred to the Indigenous people that live around this place. And has been also a World Heritage Site under co-management for many years. And then, of course, before that, been under Aboriginal management fully. Nowadays, it's not allowed to climb this rock anymore, but it took the Australian government quite a while to get to that ban. Other ways that people relate to nature can be, for example, to outdoors recreation or basically relaxation, such as yoga retreats in the Alps. This is an image of a sacred grove in Ghana that's basically accommodating the spirits of the ancestors, and also can be seen as a reservoir of medicinal plants that are only harvested based on the regulations set by the local spiritual leaders. There are many of those places around in the landscape, and conservationists think of connecting those as ecological corridors or as a backbone of a conservation strategy. There's many ways in which these sacred groves and other sacred places can be seen to be making contributions to conservation. And that's apart from the way that local people understand the importance of those places. They are central to place attachment, but also to specific species. So, such as this Samono monkey, which is endemic to a specific sacred grove in Ghana. Other ways of relating to nature can be meditation, such as here, a meditational exercise that's part of a forest walk in a protected area. And this walk has several stations where people practice different ways of relating to nature. And this is a meditation exercise people are doing in that walk. So there's different ways that people feel connected to nature and build up relationships with nature. And in this Maasai community in Tanzania, it's done through storytelling under the night sky. And the skies have a remarkable presence in many creation stories throughout many indigenous cultures. This, for example, is a lightning man depicted here on rock, probably some 50,000 years ago, and thereby also made part of the world's longest art tradition, rock painting in Northern Australia. It's very specific, but also very interesting to see this connection between art and culture being expressed on rock and having such a long continued history. the longest in the world. Conservation is practiced in many different ways by many different people. Traditional conservation, I don't personally believe, is a thing that exists or has dominance. I think it's just depending on the culture, what conservation looks like. So community fishing has a spiritual, recreational, and communal value, but it also is used to manage fish populations, such as here in Hawaii. In and around Europe, here in the Netherlands, we see importance placed on nature for burials, so nature burials. But there's also a growing presence of the importance of sacred places in different places around the world, such as here in Matatippoli in the US. This place still has not been renamed back to its original indigenous name, but signs have been put up to not disturb prayer bundles, as you can see. During the Corona crisis, we've noticed that there's lots of pressure, an increasing pressure on nature, because people really want to come back into nature and recreate. People who haven't been visiting nature much are now in nature, and discovering these qualities that nature has that they need in their lives. But also experiences such as extreme sports. This is me being out with my lads, climbing. Going to go through a few more examples and then hit substance. Around Cape Town, there's a ring of protected areas that's marked by kramats. They're Islamic shrines for Islamic saints, and they're upheld by local associations of, or local Islamic associations, so religious organizations. And it's because of those kramats that the surrounding areas have been looked after and are still today green. So these values that we attach to nature, they matter. They do inspire us, like landscape painters are inspired by the landscape. This inspiration that nature can also inspire us to relate differently to conservation. And when we look, for example, here at the cases in Yellowstone, a protected area or a national park, the first national park founded through this national park formula, as you will, before it got exported around the world in 1872. These places were, of course, sacred to the local indigenous people at that time. What does all this have to do with nature conservation as such? Well, at those very early days, a person, and I'm speaking about just after the times of the founding of Yellowstone as a national park, a person said it's of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of the red, blue, and yellow Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. And the person who said this, ironically, was Theodore Roosevelt, which admired nature, loved hunting, and also gazetted several more national parks in the US. Of course, this whole mentality about how nature should be looked after and by whom has changed. This quote, probably known by many more of you, I see no future for parks unless they address the needs of communities as equal partners of their development, of course, by Nelson Mandela, is now a famous quote. He said this at the 5th World Parks Congress. The World Parks Congress is held every 10 years by IUCN. At that time, it was held in Durban. And it was a point in time where, for the first time, indigenous people became part of the World Parks Congress. And they stood up on the stage and basically called out the established protected area community for all the atrocities and difficulties that they had posed to indigenous people. at that time, there was already some thinking going into how protected areas could change to be better adapted to the needs of local people and indigenous people. And a group of people started thinking about the importance of cultural and spiritual values in protected areas and recognizing also needs of indigenous peoples. And these were like earlier conversations about what protected areas could and should do to become better at protecting conservation, to become more equitable, and to become more rights-based. There was a set of recommendations which this specialist group on cultural and spiritual values of protected areas produced that got published out of the conference and was very much in line with Nelson Mandela's quote and the current thinking that went on between indigenous people and conservationists as such. This quote or this recommendation also inspired quite a bunch of work which this specialist group then undertook. There was a slight focus on sacred places in nature and how these sacred places could be better protected, especially when they'd be part of protected areas. Recognizing the fact that many protected area managers, for example, had no knowledge about these sacred places. And mind you, at that time, protected areas were still defined as places being looked after by a protected area service, whereas now we know that protected areas can also be areas that are being looked after by religious group or indigenous people, if they choose to so define those areas. There was a bunch of publications basically that came out based on different efforts from different institutions to mark the importance of sacred places in nature. UNESCO first started a conference on this topic in 2002, so this was just ahead of the World Parks Congress. The CBD drew up a bunch of guidelines to help steer interventions and on territories of indigenous peoples away from sacred sites and to better integrate sacred sites into planning interventions. And several other organizations started looking into the conservation benefits of those places. Until eventually in 2008, IUCN and UNESCO put hands together and developed guidelines for protected area managers to take into account these sacred natural sites. And this was a fundamentally different way of looking at nature and conserving nature. It required that, basically, and these guidelines help protected area managers basically taking these places into account. That book got translated into quite a number of languages, and we know that in several countries, sacred natural sites became part of cultural heritage legislation or protected area legislation. And so there's an advantage to developing this type of guidance through IUCN. Of course, in terms of the future of conservation, it has a limited impact because it's changing conservation from the inside, but still being part of that conservation movement / machine. In CSVPA, two initiatives started. One was the Sacred Natural Sites Initiative that looked at sacred natural sites with indigenous communities. And the other one looked at sacred places in Western or developed conservation areas. And they have both had several symposia and publications, which you can look up and see what kind of case studies were shared in these symposia and what kind of lessons were learned. For the Sacred Natural Sites Initiative, the initiative that I've coordinated for a long time, one of the co-founders, we really worked on the ground with different communities, apart from putting the custodians of sacred places into the international policy sphere. So we really helped connecting on-the-ground case studies with international policy and supported custodians to advocate for the conservation of their sacred places together with other partners. Last thing I want to talk about, and please Claire, do jump in if I'm going over time, because I currently can't see my clock on the screen. The last thing I wanted you to show today, or to talk about today, is the actual broadening the spectrum away from these sacred natural sites into the full value of parks, or the original mission of this specialist group, cultural and spiritual significance of nature. And here you see that originally in 2003, the specialist group produced a book called The Full Value of Parks. And it took quite a while to get back to that original mission statement of the group and produce eventually a best practice manual on the cultural and spiritual significance of nature, which was also co-edited together with Indigenous people from the Indigenous People and Local Communities Conserved Areas Consortium. This work has been going on for 20 years so far, and we've come up to the stage where we're really looking at how we could better be implementing these guidelines in protected areas and to actually have them make change. And it happens via small waves, which become bigger waves. And we hope that that will be the future, that these guidelines will be implemented, basically, a lot more such. Thank you.
Thank you, Baz, for that fascinating presentation and for explaining why a diversity of ways of relating to nature matter for conservation. Our final speaker will also pick up on that theme. So our final speaker is Annie Claus. Dr. Claus is an assistant professor in the anthropology department at American University and also author of the recently published book, Drawing the Sea Near, Sata-umi and Coral Reef Conservation in Okinawa.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I agree with Bram. This is the most organized presentation I've ever been a part of, so thank you very much. And let's see, I'm going to share some of my screen here. Okay, there we go. Can you see that? Yeah, there's so many linkages in what we've heard today, and I'm going to be talking about how these themes are really manifest in the Okinawan Ocean. I have a few pictures of the ocean that I'll present as I talk because I suspect that we all have a bit of frustrated wanderlust these days. In 2018, the newly elected president of the Canadian Office of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, an organization that's also known as WWF, noted, quote, WWF, like other environmental NGOs, we have not been excellent on the issue of engagement. We need to go through a process of decolonizing ourselves, end quote. Organizational changes have been really slow to develop, but comments like this indicate that WWF leadership is beginning to acknowledge the long history of abuses and missteps perpetrated in the name of environmental conservation. And the negative impacts of transnational conservation organizations' dependence on colonial and paternalistic and neoliberal logics, capitalist logics, have been thoroughly documented in social science research. Even in cases where organizations may not have been colluding with states on their own missions to seize resources and property from marginalized peoples, their protectionist policies have often legitimated coercion by perpetuating common assumptions about the most efficacious ways for conservation to unfold. Now, I refer to this exclusionary approach to conservation that Bram has also outlined as conservation far because of the distancing logics that underlie it. We see these distancing logics in the limiting and bounding of sensorial encounters in designated protected areas. We see them also in the creation of what Katya Neves or Jim Igo would refer to as the conservation of spectacle. Nature becomes something to see, not to touch or to taste. Vision becomes the primary modality for experiencing this nature. Recognition by WWF Canada's new leader that WWF needs to decolonize its practices indicates acknowledgement that the organization's abilities to make the kinds of large-scale impacts they seek will be limited unless, like June suggested in her talk, they begin to address some of the past wrongs that include other ways of knowing, being, and interacting in their conservation work. Of course, like Bas just noted in his presentation, decolonization of conservation practices will look different in different places. And I can really only talk with confidence about my field site in southwestern Okinawa. There, I undertook fieldwork with WWF Japan for 18 months, primarily in 2011 and 2012, with return visits since then. I call the affective multisensorial approach that I saw evolving over time at the WWF field station conservation near. This conservation is predicated on different kinds of relationships with surroundings than those that we see in a wilderness ideology. Conservation near is not about distancing people from environments, but rather it seeks to draw people near. And here, touch and taste and smell, in addition to seeing, are viewed as primary ways in which nature affect forms. Keywords here are really close observation, play, and patience. Conservation near nurtures an ecology of care, not in this paternalistic sense of needing to protect non-humans, but rather in a spirit of collaboration and curiosity that promotes socio-natural vitality. So I'll give an example of conservation near. You see some pictures of it here on the slide. This involves seeding clams in the nearshore sea. The clams that you see pictured here, they're called gira. They are beloved in the village. They're absolutely delicious. You can eat them in all sorts of ways and they taste really good, but they're not really of conservation interest. So the nearness that's cultivated in this project by the WWF field station is really to pass traditions, to this gustatory enjoyment, and to the tactile experience of laboring for the clams by planting them. Here you see the colorful clams buried in rock. They take about 5 years to reach harvestable size. The picture on the bottom is of middle school students who are going into the reef to plant some clams. While conservationists didn't really have much interest in this project, they were much more interested in corals in this reef. Villagers were animated by the prospect of eating these clams together. And this was one of the most popular projects that WWF undertook at this field station. People collaborated on planting and monitoring the clams over the course of a few years. Now, part of what made this project successful was the local taste for the clams. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the history of Okinawa, but it's culturally distinct from mainland Japan. It was colonized by Japan in the 1880s, and since then, it continues to be the poorest and most marginalized prefecture, a status that was exemplified in World War II when it became the site for most of Japan's land battles. After the war, the United States occupied Okinawa for 27 years, and even after reversion to Japan, that's what it's called, reversion, in 1972, it remains heavily dominated by the US military. So these post-colonial conservation dynamics in which representatives of the global North tell people in the global South how they should care for their natures is really replicated on a smaller scale in Okinawa, where islanders similarly have long been subjected to the desires and programs of mainlanders and foreign occupiers. Now, initial attempts at marine conservation at this field station looked a lot like that. Mainlanders and Westerners telling Okinawans that they should preserve their coral reef because of the precious blue corals that lived in it. Many coastal residents felt that the clam project indicated that WWF was listening to their interests and had some concern for what they might want, as opposed to the international community who cared about the blue corals in the reef, corals which, again, villagers had little interest in. Okinawans love these clams, but mainlanders tend not to have a taste for them. For Okinawans, this project also illustrates the transformation in the conservationists themselves, who had, after many fits and starts, begun to collaborate with villagers to get a better understanding of the socio-material significance of their seascape. It's important to note that this form of conservation that I call conservation near emerged out of previous failed attempts at protectionist conservation. In fact, it was a decades-long grassroots movement to thwart an airport built on the coral reef there that originally brought the attention of organizations like WWF to the region. And this movement was ultimately successful, and the reef was quote unquote saved. WWF subsequently opened its field station there in the year 2000 and found that the activism that they had previously promoted was not effective for creating long-term engagements. They made attempts to institute protectionist projects, and those projects resulted in animosity and ambivalence. Over the course of more than a decade, the field station shifted its practices to become remarkably collaborative and culturally specific. To do so, WWF built on local ideas of what constitutes Sango Shobunka, or coral reef culture. For Okinawans, the sea is associated with multisensorial engagements. Much of their interest in the nearshore sea is in fact related to gastronomic engagements. They love to eat seafoods, and many people depend on the sea for subsistence fishing and gathering of seaweeds and shellfish. The sea also has symbolic importance for them because gods dwell in it and ancestors access their village by crossing through the sea. At the field station, these local desires and cultural considerations eventually became as significant as ecological ones for conservation practice. In my book, I delineate how the shift in conservation practices was predicated on the development of a pervasive nature ideal, satoumi. Satoumi is a Japanese word that encapsulates a cultivated seascape actively produced by various human and non-human actors. It's essentially encultured nature, or what some scholars would refer to as a socio-nature. Like all nature concepts, satoumi represents an idealized version of nature. It's important to note that satoumi was not a pre-existing idea that already had legitimacy for conservation. It was actively shaped and reshaped into an idea that was readily identifiable to others as what anthropologists Terabesky and Paige West would call a conservation imaginary. Satoumi really enabled the work of WWF at its field site. This again is work that originally was more oriented to those distancing practices of conservation far. Satoumi enabled the transformation of WWF's work to the more affective, multisensorial, and collaborative practices of conservation near that eventually unfolded at the Okinawan field station. It's also important to note that neither the conservation near approach nor these marine socio-natures were widely publicized by WWF Japan's main office in Tokyo. There was a tension between the field station and the national WWF office, which saw itself as needing to uphold more of a conservation far approach. The existence of this tension and its fraught ongoing status indicates that there are and will be significant structural challenges to decolonizing the organization laterally or on a larger scale. I'd be happy to talk more about that, among other things, in the Q&A if anyone would like. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you to all of our panelists for your really interesting presentations. We have had some exciting questions come in the Q&A. Just a reminder to everyone, if you would like to ask a question, please do add it using the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. So to start things off, I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. The first question from Elifiandi Yusuf. This one is for Bram. Could you explain more about how convivial conservation approaches differ from more traditional conservation approaches in terms of human-wildlife conflict, especially with apex predators or big mammals? And then we'll move on to a question for June. How can we as international observers protect the rights of Indigenous people whose land is being illegally claimed by an existing government and is under the threat of being demolished? And then a general question. It would be good to get everyone's perspective on this one. Speaking to power is crucial. However, we need to make science, especially the natural ones, more political. Unfortunately, taking political positions is rare among academics. Sometimes when it is done, naive notions dominate. For example, Extinction Rebellion leaders tweeted in support of the Bolivian coup in 2019, thinking that it was a movement to protect forests. Do you think that we need more science for politics or more politics for science when speaking to power? So let's get started. Bram, could you talk to us more about human-wildlife conflict?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I think our approach, because I'm not exactly sure what Alifiondi is talking about in terms of mainstream approaches. I mean, but I think in our Conviva project, what we've been looking at least, because we have a project on convivial conservation in relation to predators in different countries, wolves in Finland, lions in Tanzania, the reintroduction of grizzly bears into California and jaguars in Brazil. And one of the key things, or maybe two of the key things that we're looking at is how different actors within these sites are trying to do things differently from what they've done before. So in Finland, for example, the thing that we were interested in was how the government actually stepped away to a degree and allowed for self-organizing groups to come together to find a way to live with wolves. This is not easy, none of this is easy and or should be romanticized. But that is, we thought quite an innovative approach in Finland, whereas in Tanzania, what we saw was the use of innovative insurance mechanisms, whereby communities themselves organize for when livestock gets lost to lions, etc., that they can help each other recuperate the losses and move on and still live with lions. So these are just two examples on the local level that we've studied. At the same time, what we always want to stress is not just focusing on the local level, but at the same time also the framework around it. And I think, the ICCA consortium always does this as well, right? Like the context of rights around these areas and political power, right? So it's also about trying to trace the pressures from other actors onto these sites and to try to challenge those as well. And for us, convivial conservation is always both, not just the one or the other, but always both in an integrated way.
Thank you, Bram. June, that question about
yes. So the question was, how can we as international observers protect the rights of indigenous peoples whose land is being illegally claimed by an existing government and is under threat of being demolished? Well, I always say, I guess we'll follow the lead of indigenous communities themselves and local communities. I assume that, for example, you would have known this case because they themselves are protesting and bringing this issue to light. So it depends on how do you want to get involved? Because usually, for example, once an issue has come out, there will be, for example, organizations such as the ICCA promoting it and supporting that in different levels, for example, in the local, national, and international levels. If you're talking about for example, as a concerned individual, I would say you get to know, first of all, who are you most concerned about, in terms of areas and territories. I always encourage people to be interested. I think Bram also touched this in his talk. It's be interested in the local, know what's going on in your area, and then support them in different ways. Often there are already communities who are organizing or local organizations that are organizing. You can support them. You don't have to start from scratch. And I think the first thing is also just to learn what the issues is, how to get involved. You could get involved in social media and promote it, etc. but definitely follow the lead of the communities who are affected themselves.
Thank you, Jane. That's really useful. So the third question that we had in this group was about, do we need more science for politics or more politics just for science when speaking to power? I was wondering if either Annie or Baz, if you wanted to take that one.
Well, if Andy's not jumping to it, I can say something about that. It might be both, but I agree that, you know, to a certain point, science is still being looked at as a value-free instrument, which I don't think it is really. It is in essence the practice and the application of science also political. So do we need more politics to make better use of what science can do in terms of making conservation better? Yes, probably. But politics inevitably are messy too. So you never know what result you get out of that. So in some situations, I should think it could be very helpful, whereas in others, it might complicate the matter even further. In the Netherlands, I don't think the politics have been especially helpful in favoring the sciences. We've seen budget cuts in our universities, too many of them, for scientists to produce meaningful science to support conservation. But at an international level, governments can, by placing the right science into the international policy arena, also promote, for example, movements such as the ICCA consortium. And I don't know if that's a good example, but that's where I should think that it could matter to get that support, to lend those international IDs at the national level, for example. So that's what I could possibly say there.
Thank you, Baz. June or Bram, did you want to offer any reflections on that question?
I had a thought and then it just sort of flew up. I thought the example was interesting about the Extinction Rebellion leaders who tweeted in support of Bolivian, who I don't know much about Bolivia, and thinking it was a movement to protect forests. So obviously, I think when you're looking at politics from an international or like a faraway country, of course, I think you would often get the politics wrong. But the question, I thought, the science for politics or more politics or science, I think whatever it is of which science, and I'm glad you specified natural sciences, it still has to be rights-based. It still has to be in supporting minorities or minority groups who are disfranchised from like the majority groups in whatever political like state governments that they live in. So I think a rights-based approach of whatever science that you choose. What's interesting is that in Malaysia, there's a political party that was formed promoting science. I think it's mostly from STEM. And already it's getting a lot of pushback because one of the questions that was asked to them, do you support trans rights? And they didn't want to take any stand. So that itself, like when you're saying, okay, I want to do science, it's only a science-based political party, you're still going to have a lot of missteps when you haven't really thought about how are you going to support minority groups and how do you answer these questions when minority groups say, what is it in for us that you say that you could represent us?
Thanks, June. Oh, Bram, were you going to jump in there?
Maybe just one thing. I mean, the question of science and politics, of course, is a big and old debate, and I think it's incredibly important. But one of the key things, I think, I mean, I agree with Bas and June that, you know, science is always political, and you know, so in that sense, you know, it's you have to be open about your values, about interests, and all that. But at the same time, what I feel in current academia is so focused on data and knowledge, right? As though they sort of speak for themselves. And Hannah Arendt makes an incredible sort of differentiation between knowledge and understanding. And the difference between knowledge, right? I mean, so knowledge basically is some kind of idea of why certain things have happened based on data, information that certain things have happened. But understanding, Arendt says, is about giving meaning to knowledge. It's about being able to place it in history, in context, and in relation to different positionalities. And those things give meaning, and algorithms can't do that for us, right? It's humans and in relation with non-humans exclusively that can do that and can sense those kind of things. So in order to make science political, you also have to make it meaningful. You have to relate in one way or another to different people, to positionalities within particular context in relation to histories. Otherwise it's about, otherwise it becomes speaking fact to power, right? The only thing, and that's nonsense, because that, of course it's about speaking truth to power. And that's always a balancing act between trying to do justice, to meaningful differences across, positionalities and all that, but at the same time also trying to say something that moves beyond that really touches the heart of certain things, and that allows people to see, how certain forms of power can be transcended. And I think that is the real sort of question for science these days, right? Speaking truth to power in this kind of way without losing the kind of position that scientists have in society, as maybe a little bit further away from the daily grind of things than many others who are right in the thick of things. And that is a special place that holds some responsibility. And I think all of us have a duty in that respect to try to push for that.
Thank you, Bram. We've got quite a meaty question next. What do panelists think the best approach to dealing with the 30% protected area targets in the zero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is? Are targets like this useful for expanding tenure security for Indigenous territories if ICCA-centered approaches are accepted, or should these be scrapped? Who would like to speak to that one? June?
Thanks, Jack, for your question. I have my own personal feelings about it, but also from an ICCA perspective, it's always good to engage because they recognize, for example, how this is ongoing. And I think Bram put it nicely about like these power structures and how we should be critical about mainstream conservation NGOs actually driving this debate. And the current debate right now is like 30 by 30 for protected areas. So I mentioned in my talk that for the ICCA approach was to look at, we did a global spatial analysis, which is done by the World Conservation Monitoring Network. I hope I got that right, which is it's based in the UK. So they did the global spatial analysis, and they looked at, for example, like areas that are outside protected areas that Indigenous peoples are already conserving. So you're already looking at 30%. In that sense, we've made that target. So then the question is like, what next? How then can you support Indigenous peoples and local communities who are already doing the hard work of protecting these territories of life? But I feel a lot of ways sometimes like, yeah, the 30, my personal reflection, not the organizations that I represent. And sometimes it's like, it's something to work on, something to grasp, like more funding. I think for the ICCA, we try to get the funding towards the communities themselves, like towards the local organizations who are doing the work, and not to be held up like in the technical sector and all that. But it's hard, and I actually appreciate Bram's talk about like how we have to continually like question like the power structures, like the people so much involved, and like and Bass have also touched on about like the conservation NGOs who very much take up a lot of space, the international conservation NGOs that drive the debate. Yeah. Welcome any other answers from my fellow speakers.
Would anyone else like to speak to that one? If not, I might move on to the next one from Jason Harrison, who asks, the return of Te Urarara in Aotearoa, New Zealand, from a government-controlled national park back to Ngā Tūhau Māori iwi or tribe is interesting. Have any of you looked at that in your research? No, I don't think so, but that does sound interesting. I might look that up afterwards. Okay, the next question, I might direct this to Annie, if that works for you. Do you think that traditional conservation NGOs can lead the change in conservation, or do you think that we need new players?
I think this is a really interesting question because obviously the transnational conservation organizations are incredibly important when we think about global conservation and also conservation in places. You know, they work in every region of the globe. They employ thousands of individuals. Just the top 5 transnational conservation organizations in 2018 generated over $2.7 billion in revenue. So they must be involved, but I'm not sure if they can really lead the charge. To me, I mean, I'm doing new research that's really looking at the ways that expertise, different kinds of expertise are integrated into the organizations and how disciplinary minorities, I'm really interested in social scientists and how they become effective actors in their organizations that have been dominated by natural science, at least symbolically. How do those people end up kind of making space for themselves? And it's clear through those interviews and conversations that I've had with people who work in a variety of transnational conservation organizations that funding needs to change, like the funding structures really need to change, like Bram noted. And donors really need to be also speaking louder about how they think that they want the priorities for these organizations to change. You know, there are a lot of things about them that could be drawn on and used more effectively. They have pretty effective fundraising mechanisms, for example, but whether they can lead the change, I am not convinced that they're able to do that. I would love to see them be able to do that, but I am not convinced. So I'm actually curious to hear what Bram has to say about this question as well.
I would fully agree. I'm very doubtful at the moment. I mean, yeah, they are big, like you say, and they have a massive footprint and lots of influence. And of course, I mean, lots of big conservation organizations like WWF, but also others come from elite networks, right? I mean, and they're, you know, bound to them in various ways. So somehow or the other, we still have this naive idea that if we can flip conservation organizations by really sort of hammering them on their cognitive dissonance, that at some point, you know, that could lead to maybe a bigger change. But I'm getting a little bit tired of conservation organizations shouting on the one hand, the world is going to hell, you know, all the species are going extinct and this, that, or the other. And you know, at the same time, they're trying, you know, to do some little different things.
It's interesting to note that Indigenous people have always been ahead of the conservation establishment. Anyways, they've just currently haven't got the power or the finance or the connections to make their conservation work more central at an international state or to get the recognition for it. But there could be a change there if these organizations would embrace that, and also fundamentally financially share, fundamentally recognize and financially share financial resources with Indigenous people. That would be a great step, because so far the CBDs embrace the idea of ICCAs and also the right of Indigenous peoples to either have their territories recognized as a protected area or an OECM or whatever else way they want it to be known, if they want it to be known. But there is not really a way that funding is going to trickle down, I don't think. And that's probably going to be like a really big question, because the challenges that Indigenous people are facing today, they're of a different magnitude than they have been in the past. And it's exactly those forces that, you know, Bram, you're saying we need to change these drivers, we need to close the tap. It's those forces that are also putting too much pressure on these Indigenous communities that have managed for so many generations up until now. Yeah.
Can I jump in as well? Sorry. I mean, I agree with Bram and Vaz. And what I forgot to mention in the beginning of my talk is that I'm a former conservationist. So prior to doing my PhD and where I am right now, I worked in conservation for about 12 years. And I did work for a transnational NGO, conservation NGO. And while Anne is right, is that, they do hold projects around the world. They're important for global conservation and they do hire local peoples. The fact of the matter is that often local staff are not as paid as well as, say, for example, people based in global offices. And these global offices are placed in Western countries, like in Switzerland or in New York. So I think there's a disparity in terms of, for example, where pay goes and which knowledge is appreciated, whether they're, local staff knowledge or local communities knowledge. And the Rainforest Foundation Norway they did a study where about over the past 10 years, less than 1% of financial assistance for climate change issues supports tenure Indigenous and local forest management. And only a small share of it is likely to reach Indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, as most of the money is channeled through multilateral development banks and is part of large projects of larger NGOs. And this is where I think in terms of conservation, I do support efforts made by local conservation, like NGOs themselves, like within territories and also local communities and Indigenous peoples. And I think this is where we can support them and support the work that they do and uplift all the good work that they do.
Thanks, June, and thanks everyone. I think as we're 2 minutes to past, it's time to draw this event to a close. But thank you so much to all of our panel for all of your contributions today. They were all really fascinating. And thank you to everyone for joining the event and for asking really great questions. If you'd like to keep up to date with future events from the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham, you can follow us on Twitter. It's at IDD Birmingham. And you can also go to the Forum for Global Challenges website, where the video from this event will be posted, and there will be also details about future events and things happening at the forum as well. So thank you again to our panel, and thank you everyone for coming.